Awesome. Okay, says got it. I got it. Okay, there we go. Well, again, thank you all for being here today. I count 14 of us actually all together, so that's awesome. Sounds like a fair amount of you have had maybe some experience, but it sounds like a large majority of you are here today because maybe you haven't had any experience with planning or even talking about a funeral. So first of all, I got to just set the record straight. There are no dumb questions here in this discussion. I really want you to feel comfortable to say, hey, some of you, I can't see your face, so that's even better so that you don't have to worry about it. You're kind of anonymous. But the bottom line is this, there are no dumb questions. This is the perfect time for you to ask a question, whether it be for yourself or even for just how you're gathering information so you can share with other people. So I want to make sure you understand that, get this kind of from the very beginning. So again, my name is Kurt Lind, and my wife, Barb and I own Lind Funeral Home here in Alexandria, and we also have another chapel in Parkers Prairie. We actually work with our son and his wife, Peter and Sari, and we are all licensed funeral directors. So we are actually a second generation family business. And actually, they just had a little boy, he's 14 months old, and he actually comes to work quite often. He's actually here today. Not here, but he's here in our building. We actually live in both of our funeral homes. So our homes are in our funeral home. So we live here in Alexandria. Our son and his wife live in the funeral home in Parkers Prairie. So he actually is part of our business. So I would kind of consider this a third generation family business. But I kind of want to just start with just a quote that I kind of came up with on my own. But anyway, death is the most thought about and the least talked about subject in our culture. Now, other cultures, it's not uncommon to talk about death. They're okay with it, but Western culture, we just kind of are plugged up. I don't know. For some reason, we just are very afraid of it. And I got some props with me here today. So here, this is Lucy. So Lucy is here joining us, but I want to tell you a little bit about fear. Okay. So Lucy is obviously a Yorkie. She's a Yorkie puppy, not real, just so you know this. But anyway, Lucy's a dog. If you were afraid of dogs right now, I think your anxiety would come up a little bit. And maybe your heart would start racing. Maybe you'd be a little nervous that all of a sudden I have a dog on the screen.
Hey, Kurt,
If you were afraid,
could you put Lucy up a little? People want to see her a little bit more.
there's Lucy. Can you see Lucy? This is Lucy. Hey, Lucy. We actually did have Lucy, a dog before, named Lucy. And we also have 3 Yorkies in our family that are here at the funeral home. They're actually here right now. So, and they jump around and they come greet people when they come to the funeral home. But this is not a real dog. But if you were afraid of dogs, you actually might be a little nervous right now. If you were afraid of heights, if you were afraid of spiders, if you were afraid of butterflies, before I became a funeral director, I thought of becoming a teacher, and I was going to be a student teacher until I got chicken pox when I was 21 years old, because a bunch of kids had chicken pox and I was never inoculated, nor did I have chicken pox. But the bottom line is, the teacher I taught with, she was afraid of butterflies, deathly afraid of butterflies. If you're afraid of something, it has what over you? That's a question. What do you think? If you're afraid, who's in control? Let's put it that way. Is the dog, the spider, the height, the butterfly in control, or are you in control?
They're saying the fear.
The fear is in control. So if you think about this, and I heard this not too long ago, and I really believe it's true. Every fear we have has one root cause. They all stem from one fear. That fear is the fear of death. Because if you're afraid of spiders, what's going to happen? That spider's going to bite you and you might die. If you're afraid of heights, you might fall and you're going to die. If you're afraid of dogs, the dog is going to bite you and you might die. So the bottom line is, death is a root cause of most of our fears, if not all of our fears. The reality is when you face death and you look it head on, like we're doing today, and proud of every single one of you for being online right now, because you're hearing something that a lot of people avoid because they're afraid of it. And I hear this, so just so my background, I've been doing this been a licensed funeral director for 37 years. I've been in the business for 40 years. My wife, similar amount of years here. The reality is that people, I hear this so often, when we talk about this, they say, well, if I plan my funeral, that means it's going to happen. And I want to say, yes, you are exactly right. It is going to happen. But the reality is, it doesn't mean because you planned it, it's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or a week from now. People get a little weirded out, a little superstitious about this. But the bottom line is, you are exactly right. You might die tomorrow. You might die. You might go to the doctor because you had cancer. I heard some of you say you had cancer. Bobby actually mentioned that. But the bottom line is this: we're only an appointment away from hearing from a doctor that you have terminal cancer or you have some sort of disease or whatever. And that's not the time to plan your funeral. The time to plan your funeral, which I just did yesterday, when two people asked me to come to their home, and I sat down at their kitchen table and we planned their whole funeral, everything from filling out their death certificate to filling out all the information for what they wanted for their funeral, even the cost of what it's going to cost them. And they both said, the wife said she at first didn't want, he had made the phone call when she was out buying groceries, and he wanted us to come over and talk to him. And she wasn't going to be a part of the conversation because she wasn't prepared or ready to do that. But when I got there, she sat in on the conversation. And afterwards, her comment was, I am so glad we did this together. Because the reality is, if they didn't do it together, one of them was going to have to do it alone. And this was a second marriage, which complicates that even a little bit more, because now he has his kids, she has her kids, and all of a sudden now there's sometimes a little tension that is created because of that. So I told them the same thing I just told you, is I applauded them for calling me and having me come over there and talk to them, because they actually faced the fear of death, and they weren't afraid of death, but I'm saying many people avoid it because they're afraid of it. So today I've got two goals that I want to talk about. One is planning. How do you plan for a funeral? How do you do this? And two is protecting. How do you protect money so that you know that your money will be there when you want it, and it doesn't get all spent on, say, long-term care, or that you don't have any money when the time comes and now you have to either go on the county and ask the county to take care of you, or you end up having to put that burden on your family, children, or someone else. Just last week, and I just can tell you a round of experience that I have constantly, but just a few weeks ago, a gentleman died recently, and had nobody. He had no one except a distant nephew who lives in the Twin Cities, who had not seen him for years. He had not planned one thing, has a house, no will, nothing at all. And this nephew now is totally responsible to figure out what to do with this gentleman's home and his assets, which now they find out that he has a reverse mortgage that he did on the house. They didn't know that. The house needs work. He has some debt. I'm just telling you, do this stuff in advance. It may seem overwhelming, but one of the things that we do often, and I'm gonna suggest this to every single one of you, is that hopefully after this visit today, you're gonna say, gosh, I feel like I could do this, go plan my own funeral, get things figured out, or definitely help someone with that. But funeral homes and funeral directors are here to help you. So people come in here all the time, and we don't charge for that, to sit down and talk to people. And we sit down many times for several hours and make plans and get things organized. And there's no charge to do this. So I just want to let you know that, okay? Any questions so far? I don't want to be just like talking the entire time. Not that I can't, but I'd like to hear from anybody if you have a question.
I don't see any, there was a comment in the chat that I feel like it's worth repeating. Bobby said we were all born terminal.
Yeah, amen to that one. That's very, very true. So, we are gonna die, okay? And when we face our death, just recapping, when we face our death, I can guarantee you there's a peace that comes from that. And I see people that are older and younger, and there's no age limit that says, well, you gotta be 80 or 90 years old when you plan your funeral. I mean, people still die when they're in their 20s and 30s, and babies die. So this is not something that you should just say, well, I'll do that later. It's definitely something to face and look at it head on, okay? So I'm gonna just talk about a little bit of some of the forms and some of the things that we can go through when we meet a family and we sit down and we talk about planning their funeral. One of the biggest things is that when someone dies, we have to file a death certificate. So a death certificate is no different than your birth certificate. When you're born, you get a birth certificate. When you die, there's a death certificate. Back to this family that I met with yesterday, husband and wife, there was information on that death certificate that his wife, married 15 or 20 years, she didn't know. She didn't know some of this information. Specifically, the information is, what is your father's middle name? What is your mother's maiden name? This is information that is filed, and what is her middle name? So this is information that's filed on a death certificate that you can fill out in advance. And that's exactly what we did yesterday. And that's what we do most of the time when we sit down with families, is we ask them about 20 questions that's on a death certificate. And we put that in a file that now just sits here and waits. And to be honest with you, I've got files that are 30 years old from previous owners, because we've owned this business now for, this is our 19th year. But we have people that plan prior to us buying this business that we then, basically took those files and took those accounts, and those are sitting in a file cabinet that we still have on record. So you can plan this stuff and know that you're not going to use it for a long, long time, hopefully. So the bottom line is, this is what we call a documentation or a death worksheet. This is what it looks like. It's pretty, so it's just fill in the blanks, but this is what we file with the doctor. And also, if you're going to be cremated, it has to be filed with the coroner. Every person that is cremated in the state of Minnesota has to have a coroner sign off on their death. Only being because once cremation is done, there's no way you can go back and check anything. If there was anything that was need to be investigated further or foul play or anything like that, once it's done, there's no DNA, there's nothing remaining following cremation. So this is a form that we sit down, we talk with families, and we fill out, I say almost all the time. But the other thing is, if you want to be cremated, and I know that's a real hot topic, no pun intended, but that is a hot topic right now. Lots of people talk about it. Someone asked me just yesterday, how many people are cremated through your funeral home? And I said, it's about 50%. So about 1 in every 2 people are going to be cremated. And I would imagine that some of you that we're talking right now have probably thought about that and maybe are planning on that yourself as well. But you can actually go in, and this is a cremation authorization. So this is a rather lengthy form. It's 4 pages long, but this is an authorization that has to be signed and witnessed and initialed for quite a few different areas regarding the cremation process. And I can explain this in a little bit greater detail because I think a lot of people want to know these answers, but you can do this in advance. So you can sign your own cremation authorization, which now allows you to be cremated without having to have someone else sign for you. Meaning that if you're a single person and you die, the next of kin has to sign that. And if you have children, 2/3 of the children have to agree. So if you have 4 kids and one says, I want to be cremated, or you told the one child to cremate me, but the other 3 never heard it, and they don't want you cremated, guess what? You're not going to be cremated because they have the right to say no. So it's important that you actually take the time to do this. And again, this is something that you can file, you can sit down with a funeral director or myself, fill this out. It's portable, meaning this stuff is through the whole state of Minnesota. So once it's done, it's kind of your file, it's your stuff, and it can be transferred if you need to anywhere you want it to go. So the other thing that we tend to do is we also sit down with families and talk about all the details. So I'm talking everything from what are you going to wear? If you're going to be buried or cremated, you don't necessarily have to be cremated you could have a viewing and still be cremated. So that's pretty common actually today, where we actually, whether you're viewed for just immediate family only, and if that's the case, you don't have to be embalmed. So immediate family can come view you here at our funeral home. It's not uncommon that we have them bring clothes in. We still dress the person. We put them on either a dressing table or a crematable casket, something that they just are put in and then they're cremated in that. And then also then what we do is then we have a viewing for them. Or you can actually have a service where your body is embalmed, is prepared. You have a full service where you actually have a viewing, a visitation service with your body, and then cremate that person. And that most of the time is the person is put in a crematable, or excuse me, a rental type casket, where the shell of that casket, normally it's made out of wood, is reused, and the interior lining and a box with the body in it comes out the side of that and and then the shell is reused. New boxes put in, new lining, new pillow, and everything else. And then actually, then you have that person is cremated in what you've removed from that box. All right. So, but like I said earlier, we can actually sit down with families and everything. If they're military, that's another big thing. If someone says, "Well, I was in Vietnam, or I was in World War II, or whatever," or it doesn't really matter whether you're a Army National Guard, but you're entitled to military honors. And so that's something that we would like to talk about, because we need to find out, do you want to have military honors? Do you actually want to have the flag draped over the back of the casket? Do you want it folded in the 3-point star that's up on your left shoulder for the services? Do you want military honors? Do you want to be buried at a veterans cemetery like Little Falls over at Camp Ripley or Fort Snelling? There's one up in Duluth. There are other national cemeteries also that you're maybe be eligible for as well. So it's important to know if you're a veteran, and that could be for men or women. It doesn't really matter. Jewelry is, here we go. Do you need a copy of their discharge papers? Yes, we do. It's called a DD 214. And that's something that we need to see and make a copy of, because we go actually get that burial flag ourselves. So the funeral home gets that. And then they're entitled to things such as a marker, a bronze flat marker, or sometimes it's upright, those marble white markers that you see like at Fort Snelling, they can get those as well. Sometimes there's some benefits that they might be entitled to. We don't know that until they file after they die. But you know, if they're like receiving a pension because of a disability due to wartime or even non-wartime disability, there's probably going to be some benefit that the widow is going to receive, as well as you know, just some burial benefits that would be paid for funeral expenses. But some of the other things we talk about with families when they're here is jewelry. So do you want the jewelry left with you? Most of the time it isn't. Most of the time it's taken off. But there's people that they want their mother's ring on. They want to wear their wedding ring, or they haven't worn their wedding ring for 5 years because their hands have been too swollen or whatever. But they want to have it on. And then most of the time we remove that and give it back to the family upon closing the casket or before cremation. The other thing we do is we take thumbprints. So we can take a thumbprint of that person's finger, and we can actually have jewelry made with that. And that's kind of common now. We're seeing it more and more. So it might be a pendant that someone wears. It could be a dog tag or a keychain. There's different things you can do with it. There's no charge for us. At least we don't charge to take the thumbprint. just stays in the file. But then also, at that point in time, if down the road they want something that they would like to have as a keepsake or give to the grandkids or something like that, this particular piece of jewelry that is made through our funeral home is a raised print. So it's actually a wax cast of that fingerprint. So when you touch the piece of jewelry, it feels like their finger. It actually is a raised print, so it feels like their finger. So anyway, those are some of the things we talk about. What about graves? I mean, how many of you actually know where you're going to be buried? Or cremated? Or buried after you're cremated? That's a good question too. So I see what happens is, it took my wife and I probably till, we've been married 25 years this year, and 4 years ago, we finally decided to be buried in Parker's Prairie and bought graves out there. But prior to that, my wife is from Two Harbors. I'm from Moline, Illinois. We were like, well, you know, my mom and dad had some graves down in Illinois. My Barb's mom and dad and her grandparents are in Two Harbors, but her parents don't like to go visit the graves. So she's like, well, I don't really want to go up there. So how are we going to do this? And it took us some time to figure it out, but I have an idea. Okay, so answer that. So you have an idea, but you haven't acted on it yet. You want to share what that means?
Well, that means we know where we want to select a columbarium, but we haven't done it yet.
Okay.
So that would be part of our planning, which comes along with part of this meeting today, I think, to be a catalyst for us.
Yeah, and you know, that's really good, because a columbarium, you know, there's rows of those. So there's some on the bottom, some in the middle, some on the top. The price goes up for these depending upon where you're at, almost like shelving at a grocery store. So eye level is more expensive than the ones on the ground. And it's probably good to go out and decide, well, where do we want to be exactly when we buy these? So that's a good thing, Bobby, that you're thinking that. But anyway, it does take some time to think this through, to like, where are we going to be? And I know that a fair amount of people today talk about it and they say, oh, it doesn't matter, just throw me in the yard or bury me in the bushes or throw me in a lake. Well, first of all, you need to understand that in Minnesota, it's illegal to put your cremated remains in any sort of water in Minnesota. That is illegal. Do people do it? I could turn my head the other way and say, yes, they do. But it is illegal to do that, okay? So you're not supposed to be putting that in. And the reason why is cremated remains is what's left after your body is cremated. And what do you think that is left over? Anybody? All right. It's your bones, okay? So your bones don't cremate. Now, I'm not saying all the bones, because some of the bones in our hands and parts of our body, they're very small. So they cremate because it's very intense. So I'm going to talk now about cremation a little bit. We'll get back to burial, but cremation is about 1,800 to 2,000 degrees for about 3 hours. And what happens is that your body, pretty much all the soft tissue, everything basically burns up. And what's left over are some of the larger bones. All right. So you've got pieces of the bones that don't cremate, parts of the skull, bigger femurs, and, you know, your hips and some of those things. Some of those parts of the body don't cremate. Also, other parts that don't cremate, and that's part of this disclosure, this authorization that I showed you earlier that needs to be signed by the family, is if you have a hip replacement or some screws in your body or anything that's foreign, that will not cremate. If it's metal, if it's plastic, that's different. But if it's metal, it won't cremate. And so that has to be removed from the cremated remains before the remains can be processed, because they're processed, meaning that they're actually crushed into almost like a powder form. So if you've seen the Great Lebowski movie, and I just saw it not too long ago, you realize that cremated remains actually are something that is not like ashes. I know we talk about it being ashes to ashes, dust to dust, but it's really the bone weighing about 8 to 10 pounds. That's what's left over. Any pieces of metal have to be removed before that is processed, and we put that into medical recycling waste. So that's what you give us permission to do that. I've only had one time in my entire career when someone asked me to give them back their mother's hip. No, it was their knee, a knee replacement. And we just said, just curious why they wanted it back. And she said, well, when that day comes and I need a knee replacement, then I'll be able to use that. We assured them that that would not be the case, but she took it anyway. So anyway, so that's removed. And then what we have is the cremated remains weighing about 8 to 10 pounds. And most of the time people put that in some sort of an urn or something that is either going to be buried or they might keep it for a while. But again, it's something that you have to think about. What are you going to do with these remains? I think eventually you need to figure out, are we going to bury them? If you put them in a lake, if you choose to do that, you bury them in your backyard. I'll tell you a story here in a second, or put them on the farm because you think, hey, you know what? I just love being in the farm, or I like going out in the woods, up by the peak or something like that. The bottom line is this: you will lose your legacy when you choose to do that. So your life's legacy is gone as soon as you take your remains and dump them somewhere, because that farm will probably not be your farm forever. You will not be able to go somewhere because you're not going to memorialize that. And I'll tell you a story that happened. This happened to me actually, but someone did choose to bury their remains, their mom's remains, at the cabin at the lake. And it was just a place that they had fond memories of, and they went there, for years and years and years. So when she died, they buried her at the cabin, and life went on. And then it came to the point where they were going to sell the place. And they asked the owner at that point, who was going to buy it, do you mind if we come back, just a few times a year to memorialize mom at the lake, because this was just a special place for her. And the owner said, yeah, not a problem. Yeah, that's just fine. So on the birthday, they'd come and they'd put some flowers at the little grave that they had buried her in. And they did that maybe a couple times a year. Well, time went by, and this individual sold the property to someone else. And that individual did not allow them to come back on the property. And they were trespassing at that point in time. And it did not bode well. It did not go well, nor did they allow them to dig up mom and move her at that point in time. So now she's in some foreign land, so to speak, and they were distraught about that. And so a cemetery is always going to be a cemetery. It's always a place where you can go, a mausoleum, a crypt. It doesn't really matter, but you're always going to be able to go there. And I'm not even saying you can't separate those remains, meaning you could put, the funeral home would separate them for you and give you half, take half somewhere, take them out to, my sister took her husband to Scotland actually, because he was a full-blooded Scotsman and she wanted to take him back there, but she did keep some of his remains and had them buried. So I just want to say it's important to have a place you can always go to. So just remember that as you move forward on this. Pacemakers. So if you have a pacemaker, we can't have a pacemaker in your body if you're going to be cremated. And the reason why is a pacemaker is actually a battery. And what happens if you throw a battery in a fire, it'll explode. And the pacemaker will make, and it's also covered in a very strong metal. So it actually becomes almost like a bomb. And so if that thing goes off, not only could it hurt the operator who's caring for that individual while they're being cremated, but also it could damage the retort, the inside of the retort, and they are very, very expensive pieces of machinery. So, so we remove pacemakers. That's one question on this form right here. It just says any heart pacemaker implants even radiation producing devices. That all has to be removed because obviously that's going to cause issues for the operator, us, that's going to be involved in getting that person cremated. So that probably is a good question to ask people if they're thinking about cremation is, do they have any sort of implants that we need to be aware of? Because that will be asked at that point in time.
Do you guys remove those implants then?
Yep, we do, right here. Yep. So obviously, we are, you would consider ourselves derma surgeons, derma meaning death. So we really are death surgeons. Our procedure is very sterile, not sterile, but it's very, when we are embalming bodies, and you know, I'd welcome any one of you to come to my funeral home and get a tour, and I would show you everything from the funeral home to the back room to the prep room to show you this. But it's much like an operating room. We're dressed in full garb so that, you know, we're protecting ourselves and anybody else that's in there. And so we do the surgery, meaning that we sometimes have to do major surgery. Someone's in a really bad accident, and now we have to kind of put them back together again, which we've had to do that many times. Or someone has an autopsy, or now they've been actually taken to a coroner, or a coroner has done their internal investigation, meaning they've had to open up their chest cavity, open up their head to remove their organs so they can look at how they died. We've got to put them back together again so people can view them or prepare them for cremation at that point in time. So yeah, so it's pretty fascinating actually what we do. And I call myself sometimes, let's see if I got a couple other props here. Well, yeah, here we go. So sometimes I call myself kind of the Mad Hatter, because I'm kind of like a little bit of a mad scientist sometimes. Because when you're in the back prep room, you have different people that actually die of different things, and you need to know kind of what that is. So if someone's diabetic, it's helpful for us to know that. If someone's had a stroke, it's helpful to know that, because we need to kind of do different things for the embalming or preparing that body before they actually are getting ready to be viewed. And so it takes time and some effort to kind of figure all that stuff out. Some of our background, just so you know, as a funeral director, we actually all have gone to the University of Minnesota. So we're all graduates of the U. And then after we graduate, we have a 1-year internship. So it's a 5-year program here in Minnesota that you actually go through to become a funeral director. And you learn everything from psychology to sociology to running a business, you know, accounting and business and embalming and cosmetology, and you know, you have a cadaver that you work on, and we actually know where every vein and artery is in your body, because we need to know how to prepare you and get you ready for a funeral. And so that's all done at the University of Minnesota. And so that is something that obviously, if you're interested, it's a fascinating profession to be in. And I'll be honest with you, there is a huge shortage of funeral directors today. And it's only going to get worse, because the baby boomers are all going to start dying. So if any of you are like, you know, I wonder if I wouldn't mind being a funeral director, that'd be kind of a cool thing to do. It's very demanding. It can be really challenging, but the rewards are amazing, absolutely amazing. And so just food for thought for any of you that might be interested for a second career, or maybe even a first career. So, or someone in your family that might be interested. We have someone that just called the other day that wants to job shadow us and just see kind of what we do as a funeral home, and kind of see if this is something they want to do. So anyway, it's open invitation. All right. So they're off with that hat. So we even plan lunches. That was the other thing yesterday. So I'm talking to this husband and wife, and they're talking about lunch. It's going to be at St. Mary's Catholic Church here in town, and they don't make food like they used to. Years ago, when I first was in the business, all the churches had all these like service, you know, ladies' aid and everybody else, and they all made the food and everything else. And today you have like 2 people or 3 people that are able to help on a funeral. Well, they can't do everything like they used to. So most churches today cater food. And so that was something we talked about yesterday. What do you want for your service? You know, he decided he wants a hot dish. He wants hot dish and buttered buns and, you know, desserts and maybe some coleslaw. I mean, we do all of this as a funeral home and we take care of these details. And again, I'm not saying every funeral home does this. I'm saying this is what we do. So we figure everything out, right? Every detail related to the funeral, we figure out with the family, and this can be done at need. So now we're sitting here because somebody died and we're planning all this, or pre-need, meaning now you're doing this in advance, but we figure everything out for you and take care of it. And what we do many times is what we call a cash advance. So a cash advance item is something that is paid for the family by the funeral home that just shows up on the funeral bill. So as an example, this is a contract. So it's just pretty simple, but this contract is divided up into really 4 categories. The very top category is talking about the services of the funeral home. So really embalming, going and getting the person where they died. If you're going to have a visitation or a viewing, running the funeral, everything from all the use of the hearse, all those details are listed on this top portion here, and there's costs for all of those. And for most funeral homes, you know, those costs that I just mentioned to you are kind of the minimal costs. The bulk of a funeral costs for a funeral home is the overhead. Because you think about it, we're not much different than an ER room at a hospital. We're here 24/7, 365 days out of the year. Someone has to be ready to go at a moment's notice. So people will say, well, really? So if my mom dies at 2 a.m, you actually go to work? Absolutely. You know what? But we're not going to say, you know what, we'll be there at 8. Can you just wait? No. I mean, if there's a death, we're generally very much very prompt, and we're there generally within the hour, and many times a lot shorter than that because we live in our funeral home. So we can get to our vehicles and take off sooner. But the reality is you pay an overhead charge to the funeral home, and that's the bulk of your funeral costs to the funeral home. The building maintenance, the lights, the taxes, insurance, salaries, all that's packaged into that. And then the second category is dealing more with like the merchandise. So when you're here, you're going to maybe, if you're going to be buried, you're going to pick out a casket. And most cemeteries require a vault. That's the outer burial. So people all know what a casket is, but maybe a lot of people don't know what a vault is, or an outer enclosure that's required by the cemetery. And that requirement is a cemetery requirement. So some people get confused. They think it's a requirement by the funeral home or the state of Minnesota. It's requirement of neither one of those. It's actually the cemetery. So everybody at a cemetery, or every cemetery, generally has some sort of board or directors or someone's in charge of that. And they come up with a list of rules or laws, bylaws, that are required for you to be buried at that cemetery. And most cemeteries require some sort of a container to put the casket in at the cemetery. And the reason why, and because I'll ask this question, but most people don't answer it, so I'm going to tell you. But the reason why we use an outer burial container is that if you go to an old part of any cemetery, something 100 years ago, or even when they started about in the 60s is when vaults started, but anything before 1950 in the 40s, but earlier on than that, you'll see these sunken in areas at a cemetery, and the markers tipping over, and it's hard to mow and all that kind of stuff. And it's just difficult to maintain a cemetery when that happens. Is this outer burial container, most of them are going to be made out of concrete, but that will not decompose. If you put a casket in the ground, whether it's made of metal or wood, it doesn't matter. But over time, that's all going to rust or rot and decompose with the person inside it, and everything will decay, and that will slowly sink down where it was once holding the ground integrity, and it's gonna just slowly sink, and that's happened in all those old cemeteries, is the grave has settled where everything has decomposed. And so that's what a vault keeps from happening. So the bottom line is that's part of the merchandise that one will look at when they're at a funeral home. Also, and that if you're gonna be buried and if you're gonna be cremated, there's urn vaults. And some cemeteries require an urn to be put into a vault as well. An urn. So, okay, so let's say you're gonna be cremated. You can come look at my funeral home, and I've got a whole variety of urns to look at. Every funeral home will have those for you. You can look at a catalog. You can order urns online. You could actually order a casket online today if you wanted to. But those are things you can purchase by yourself. And most of the time, people will come in here and they'll even say, well, can I make my own urn? Excuse me. And I'll say to them, absolutely, I would prefer you to make an urn, because the bottom line is then it's more personal. You actually done something that you really, really like. But the bottom line is, I will say one time, only once it's happened. Well, no, it happened just about 3 weeks ago. Someone actually had an urn that someone had made for them. And I didn't see it ahead of time. And so I said, sure, that'll work out just fine. So they brought the urn in after the services because he was embalmed. The gentleman was embalmed. We had a service for him, a viewing and a funeral, and then he was cremated. And she brought this urn in for him to be put in that a friend of hers had made. And for some reason, it was way too small. I really thought right away, I looked at it, I said, I don't know if that's going to work, but I said, I'll give it a try. So I excused myself for a little while and I came back and I said, well, I measured everything out and we can actually put those remains in that urn, but you're going to have, just excuse the term, but you're going to have leftovers. And so the reality is she's now going to have 2 boxes of her husband's remains because the first urn that she was going to get from a friend was too small. The urns that we have here, they're all built to hold anybody that's cremated. And I don't care. I had someone that recently said, well, wow, that person was so big. I mean, they were really a heavy person. But the bottom line is, keep in mind, I already told you this, that what's left over is not the soft tissue, it's the bone. And you don't know how much is going to be left in your body until you're cremated, if you're going to be cremated at all. So the reality is you have to make sure it has 220 cubic inches. That's the minimum amount that you can actually have in an urn to hold any body. So that's what all of our urns are. So just know that if you're going to provide an urn to the funeral home, 220 cubic inches. And you can actually bring in, we've had people bring in tackle boxes. And one of the very first things I did here in Alexandria is someone brought in a Harley Davidson motorcycle engine. And we actually put the remains down inside the engine where the piston was, I don't know how we did it. It was very complicated, but it worked. So anyway, so those are just some of the things that we call merchandise. Stationary items is another one. So like if you're going to have memorial folders and a register book and thank you cards, those are things that the family can provide themselves, but also many times we'll do that. I'd say 95% of the time we do that for them. So that's called our stationary items. So when you pick out what you want, you can design it yourself. You can say, I want it to look like this or whatever. And we along with our kids will help families design those. And it's something that people will keep afterwards. So those are basically the charges for the merchandise. Additional services might be like, now I have a marker at the cemetery, or I need a marker at the cemetery. Most cemeteries require markers. They generally give you a little time, maybe about, this is after someone's buried. So if you buy a grave and nobody's buried there, you don't have to put anything on that grave. But when someone finally is buried there, they do ask that you actually put a marker on there within 1 year. Most cemeteries, I can't say that's all the case, but I just was at a cemetery last Saturday, not too far from here, and there are 80 listen to that, 80 unmarked graves where there are people buried at that cemetery and they don't know where they're buried. But there's 80 people in that cemetery. So it happened to be that we were burying a full casket and they ran into somebody twice trying to bury this individual, and they had to just stop, cover up the grave, and they ended up moving the person like 10 feet away from where they were supposed to, and their name was on the marker that was over here, and they ended up being buried 10 feet away because there were 2 people that were buried on that cemetery that were unmarked. So that's why it's important to mark your grave, FYI. But the other big thing I want to talk about here would be cash advance items. So cash advance items, and I'm going to keep moving here because I know we got to go till what is it, 3 o'clock, Stephanie? We go till?
Yep, we'll pause for lunch here in a few minutes. Noon.
I'm teasing. No, we're good. We're good. I'm just teasing you. I could go on all day long. So, but anyway, cash advance items, because we got to get to the protecting your money, how you do that. That's a really important part. But cash advance items are something that we do as well. That's everything from obituaries to death certificates to flowers to a hairdresser to vocalists, the pastor, snow removal, digging the grave, death certificates. These are all things that are part of the funeral, but they're not really something that we do. Meaning that I'm not going to go out and dig the grave. I'm not going to go out and put, do the hair. We have hairdressers come in. So that's all stuff that we will pay for, and it shows up on the actual bill. Or you can pre-plan that, meaning you can pre-fund that, put that in your trust account, so that's all ready to be paid for when that time comes. All right. So that's just a general overview of funeral costs and really what things do. And in everybody's funeral is different. There isn't one funeral that's going to be exactly the same. This gentleman yesterday and his wife, her funeral was more because she picked out a different casket than he did. He wanted this one and she wanted that. She's going to have her hair done. He won't need his hair done. There are some other things that makes difference. So that's why it's important to really sit down, and you can figure out, when we meet with families, I can tell them to the penny how much their funeral is going to cost. All right. So then so it's like, okay, I know what's going to cost. I'm going to be cremated. That's what it's going to cost to be cremated. I'm going to be buried. That's what it costs to be, buried, or whatever it might be. So let's talk about, how do you actually protect or fund this? So that's a huge part of this as well. So you can plan everything, and honestly, you could stop right there. You could just say, and there's plenty of files that I have in my file cabinets that people haven't fully funded or even funded the funeral. Most have, but there are some that have not. The reality is that you could just stop right there. You could say, I'm going to plan my funeral. I'm going to write my obituary. I'm going to do all the things that I want to have and have it ready to go. And I'm going to stop. Most people want to go the next step, which is, I want to protect that money. Now I know that, Kurt, you sat down with me. I know my funeral is going to be, and I'll be honest with you, an average funeral today, just so you understand this, for a burial funeral with a casket, all the things I just listed, all the cash advance items, we're talking probably about $15,000 today. So it has gone up. I mean, if you see it online or you go on TV at night, late night television, they'll say a average funeral is like $8,500. That's not true. They're not including all the things that we're including in there. So again, keep in mind that $15,000 is maybe $1,000 in there for food, because you're going to have 150 people at the funeral and you're going to put aside, $7 a plate. So the reality is that all of this stuff is all figured out, and you can decide at that point, okay, I've got some money that I want to fund my funeral. I want to pay for this in advance. You could do it one of two ways. You can either say, okay, I'm going to do this. I've got money sitting in an account somewhere that I want to pay for this. Now, again, I understand that if we're younger, you probably don't have $15,000 sitting somewhere that you want to just pay for your funeral, but you can pay for it over 3, 5, or even 10 years. So it becomes a smaller amount of money that you pay every month, and you can just pay for this in advance. No different than paying for your car insurance or homeowners insurance or life insurance or whatever. But at the end of it, it's all paid for and it's done and it's not gonna go away, meaning that it's not gonna like eventually dissolve like some insurance policies will. Talked to someone just the other day who had bought 2 whole life insurance policies for themselves quite a few years ago, and they're older now. This gentleman is my age. I'm 62 and he just gonna be 62 coming up here. He bought these policies when he was younger, and whole life, unfortunately, when you get older, like I don't think I'm that old, but when I get older, the reality is the cost to insure you goes up. So pretty soon, unless you keep paying into this thing, it starts to go backwards, meaning that the value of that policy starts to decrease. So even though you say, hey, I had a $25,000 life insurance policy, whole life or a 50-year, doesn't really matter, those can slowly eat away at themselves. Where a funeral trust will never do that. It can only increase, because what happens is that you put this money aside and it's interest bearing. It's like a savings account. It grows with interest. Currently right now, the interest I think we're paying out on these is 2.25%. So I'm like, well, gosh, where do you get 2.25% today? Don't get it on any money sitting in the bank, that's for sure. And I'm not slamming banks or whatever. I'm just saying the trust account is a safe place to put your money. The money will always be there for you, and it's irrevocably assigned. What I mean by that is that the money can't be touched by anybody until you die. So you go in the nursing home, you have some health issues that now have people come into your house that have to take care of you. There's bankruptcy. Whatever it is, this money is locked into your account. It is your money. It stays there, and it can never be taken from you until the day you die. And basically what happens is that, like I said earlier, it's interest bearing. It's also portable. So it follows you wherever you go. It's your money, even though it's trusted, say at our funeral home, if you moved away, you went somewhere else, you decided to have another funeral home take care of you when that time comes, that money moves with you, including all the interest. So it's a win-win situation for you, because not only is the money protected for those that you love and care for, who now know that the burden is taken off of them, but that money will always be there for you. And when the time comes and you have now the claim is being made, so now you die, the funeral home does all the work. They initiate the contract. They actually get the money back to the funeral home. You know how much money has been given. And so at that point in time, within 48 hours, that money is paid to the funeral home, directly to the funeral home. And so what happens is that at that point in time, if there's money left over, if there's some changes or there's some money left over, it goes back to the estate or to the family. Now keep in mind, if you're on medical assistance, so MA, if you're on medical assistance, they may have the right to come after that money if it's left over, okay? And the other thing is, it's important to talk to your clients and even for yourself to realize people should do this before they go on medical assistance. Because with medical assistance, I'll just take, for instance, in Douglas County, and you know, we work very closely with Douglas County, and we appreciate what they're doing. But the bottom line is, when you're on medical assistance, there have been some strict stipulations that say you can only have this, you can only do this, you can only spend this. So there's some guidelines when you're on medical assistance and now you're planning your funeral. If you've done it prior to being on medical assistance, those guidelines don't follow you. So I'm in my 60s, I'm in my 50s, I'm doing fine. I plan my funeral. Now I die when I'm 80 years old and I am on medical assistance. Now, again, I don't know what the future is going to be like, but right now I'm just telling you that it's better to do this prior to go on medical assistance. You know, if it's a spend down, do it before you go on medical assistance. Don't wait and then try to figure this stuff out later on. But like I said, the money goes back to the family. So that's not the case in all states. So some states are this is 100% trust state. Minnesota is. It's highly consumer driven. So what I mean by that is that some states, if you came in and you plan your funeral with XYZ funeral home, and now you changed your mind or you moved from Arizona back to Minnesota and you planned it down in Minnesota or Arizona, they might be able to keep some of that money. Some states up to 20%. So you think about that, you put aside $15,000 in your funeral, and now you decide to go somewhere else, they get to keep $3,000 of that when you walk away. I think that's wrong. Personally, that's not right. But the bottom line is that's how the laws are in certain states. So it's not the case here. So the money is always yours. If for some chance now the funeral comes and it's more than what you've had put into that account, then you have to pay the difference. Obviously, it's not a guarantee. But what we do is, because that interest is growing on those accounts, we strongly work at keeping our rate of inflation tied to those trust accounts. So I can't tell you the last time that I've had families when they fully funded a funeral and made no changes that they had to come up with any money at all. So it was pretty much a wash, even though it was maybe 10 years later, they were able to just kind of come in and review everything, and they walked away and didn't have to come up with any money at all. So I've talked about a lot of stuff, and I don't like to be just the only one talking here, but I love what I do. My wife loves what she does. We've been, like I said, we've been married and have done this together for 25 years. And like I said, I've been a funeral director for almost, oh, there we go. Reminder, if you have any questions. Oh, that's from Stephanie. So any personal questions, again, this can be anonymous. I don't have to say your name or anything like that, but the bottom line is, this is the perfect time to talk to a funeral director. And it could be something that you've always like, man, I've always wondered about that. I should ask him or whatever. I'm not going to give you a time off, just so you know, I got lots of things I could talk about. Fun stories, all kinds of cool things. There you go. How long does the family have to pay? Okay, so this is why you want to trust your money. This is why you want to put your money in an account. Some funeral homes will allow you to have 30 days. Our funeral home policy here, and actually some funeral homes will assist. I know one particular funeral home, or I know a group of funeral homes that you have to pay when you make arrangements. So now you're sitting here making funeral arrangements for your mom that just died yesterday or the day before, and now you're figuring all this out, and they expect you to pay in full at their funeral home that moment, right there. Before you leave the building, you have to pay. That is not the case. We do ask for half down, and then the balance in 10 days. That's our policy. Now, again, some families will say, man, could you just wait a little bit or whatever? I got something going on here. Insurance, I will answer that question. I saw it just come in here. Insurance is another big thing. So some people say, well, I've got life insurance. Life insurance sometimes will take 30 to 90 days to get a life insurance policy. Now, some are much faster, but they're not all that fast. And there's a lot of paperwork. You have to wait for the death certificate before you can claim a life insurance. If it's a coroner's call, we have some coroner's calls that we're still waiting on. They have up to 3 months sometimes to get a death certificate. So it's not like you can just get this stuff right away. So that's why it's important that you think about these expenses ahead of time and make sure that you actually have this stuff funded because each funeral home is different and their policies are different. There was a question earlier, something about an urn I saw.
Yeah, it's like, could you talk about having an urn and wanting to be buried with another person? Is that okay or not? What are the guidelines?
Yeah, we actually have some where actually we have urns that a husband and wife are together. So you could commingle them, put them together. It has to be big enough. Now, keep in mind, 220 for one person, it had to be 440 for two people. It had to be big enough. You can buy an urn that big from us, or you can go make an urn. So again, that doesn't really matter. But yes, the answer is you could put people together and bury them together. I saw another question that just came in.
Well, my mind just went to, so if one dies before the other, do you open the urn back up then and put that other person?
So what happens? Yep. So what happens is there's a lot of people that have urns in their house today. All right. Now, I don't keep urns. My policy is not to keep an urn here in my funeral home. Even though I have in this room, I have a huge room that I could probably store hundreds of cremated remains here. I choose not to, only because of my liability. If I had a fire here, I would be responsible for every one of those bodies that were lost in my or tornado or something like that. So people take cremated remains home, and I can't tell you how many people that have them under their bed, in a closet, somewhere. And so, yes, that's what you would do. If you wanted to wait until you died, you would just hold on to your dad's or your husband's remains. And when you died, you tell your kids, make sure that the funeral director puts me with them or with dad, and then bury me together. Yep. I saw another couple questions come in.
Yeah, so this one's going to COVID, which we talked about earlier, so or that it might come up. So have you had experience helping people access FEMA reimbursements for COVID related to funerals? And how many requests have you had?
Yes, have probably about 5 or 6. We didn't have like these huge amount of COVID deaths that they were saying that were happening around here, but we had probably by now 7, 8 people that died of COVID. And yes, every one of those families, we gave them information. We could not help them with it. The FEMA asked that they call direct. Everything was done over the phone. So there was no paperwork that had to be sent in. It was all done over the phone. They explained everything to them, and they went through the process by phone. I've talked to several family members that are still waiting. There's a time that it takes for that money to come through, and it's not like, okay, everybody gets $8,000. They look at what you paid for the funeral, how much the funeral was. So there is a reimbursement, but it's up to, I believe, $8,000. Is there another question that came in there?
Nope, that was just saying, someone commenting that their parents are in 2 urns.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want people to understand that everything is so, you can be very creative. You can do some amazing things with a funeral, and it really is a celebration of someone's life. I'm gonna just highlight one thing. This comes up quite a bit, and the longer I've been a funeral director, the more willing I'm willing to just talk about things with families and be a little more bold. So when someone comes in and they say, you know what, I want to be cremated, and I don't want anybody looking at me, and I don't like that, and so I'm just going to be cremated, and I don't want anything. And I've come to the terms to say to those families, just so you know, when you die, it's not about you anymore. It's not. It's about what, as you are sitting there with your husband, and I'm looking across the room from you in the same table that I'm sitting at right now, to say it's about what he's going to need, or about what you're going to need when you die. And what about your kids? And I'll say to them, do you have children? Oh yeah, we've got 4 kids. How many grandchildren do you have? Yeah, we have 12 grandchildren. What are they going to need? Okay, forget the general public. If you don't want people walking by and looking at you because that bothers you, well, then don't do it. Okay, that's fine. But what is your family going to need? I can't tell you how many times I've had like siblings, not immediate family, but like someone dies and their brother or sister comes to the funeral expecting to come see their brother or sister, and they've been cremated. And they walk in the room, and there's a little box sitting up on top or in front of the funeral home with a picture above it, and it just isn't the same. And I'm not trying to sell you off of cremation. All cremation is another form of disposition. What do I do with your body? Okay, do I bury it? Do I cremate it? Those are the 2 most common. Do I donate it? That happens. You can donate your body to the U of M. But during COVID, just so you know that, we had 2 families during COVID that were turned down because they were not accepting bodies during COVID. So they had all these plans. They were going to be donated to the University of Minnesota. So that's how it was going to work. And guess what? That didn't happen. So now they're sitting in the room having to plan a funeral and plan something that they didn't expect. So you can have the plans, but have a plan B and a plan C just in case. Okay, but specifically the donation part of it, that's kind of, it's a wonderful thing. Obviously, we had people that donated their bodies that we used for learning how to be funeral directors. So I'm ever grateful for those individuals, but it didn't happen for 2 families during COVID. COVID was really challenging for us. I'll just highlight a couple things here. You know, when the mandate first came down, we were mandated no funerals, or minimum of, I think it was 5 or 25 people we could have. I mean, we were used to having funerals with 300, 400 people, and all of a sudden you're saying 25 people could show up. Some of the families were 100 people. So now you're telling me I could only have 25 of my family show up and be in the same room. It got really difficult for us. And so for a while there, we were like managing where the people would come and then they'd have to leave, and then another group would come in and then they would leave. We ended up having outdoor, we went to outdoor services. We had actually had outdoor funerals. We had outdoor visitations where we had like a tent and the body was underneath the tent, and we had like cars coming by. We did one specifically at the Covenant Church where we had over 400 cars come by because it was the pastor's wife that had died, and she was in a casket, and they drove by and he was outside and the family was all outside greeting everybody in their cars. Some people wouldn't roll their windows down because they were so afraid of getting COVID. Sometimes he didn't care. He just would reach right in, he'd hug on people, and and as a funeral director, that's not my job to say, get out of that car. Don't touch that person. It's like, okay, he's just lost his wife, and I'm not there to tell him what he can and cannot do. He wasn't wearing a mask. I'm not saying whether you believe in this or whether you agree with it or not. The bottom line is every family is different, and that is our job, is to take care of them and meet their needs. And there were a lot of people. I can't tell you how many people that came in here during COVID that couldn't see their loved one when they died. They couldn't even be with them. That breaks my heart, that they were so upset that they couldn't say goodbye because they couldn't get in the hospital, and their loved one, their wife, their son, their daughter is dying alone. Give me I'm an explicit word there, but give me a break. I mean, how horrible is that? These people are going to live with that damage done to them for the rest of their life. That was wrong. I'm sorry, that was just wrong. And you know what? I'm just being personal there on that. And so we now had to help them through that time. And I think we did honor those individuals, but some of the damage done, because of just the limitations. And I get it. Nobody knew what to do. We just didn't know what to do in those early months, even that first year. And so people were freaking out, and it was really, really sad. But boy, there was a lot of carnage because of that. And it was sad. It was really, really hard and challenging for us, because now we're here to help them and trying to get them through this. So don't take that personally. If there's anybody in the healthcare business here, I'm not slamming anybody. I'm just saying we all knew. We just didn't know what to do, okay? And so we made mistakes. We did make some mistakes, and we had to kind of do the best we could do under the limitations that we were given. And I think we did a good job, but yes, could we have done more? Probably so. Even us. So I'm not saying we did the best we could. One thing that came out of this is live streaming. So, you know what, prior to that was kind of like, you just didn't do that, or that was like maybe in California, they live stream where you could watch it, you could be in Florida on the beach watching your grandma's funeral, and it's in California. That was always like, wow, that's kind of cool, but nah, we're not going to do that. COVID forced us to do that. And now it's routine for us to offer that to families. So we have a very nice system right here at our funeral home. If we go to a service, if we can't live stream it, we'll record it. So we offer that to families. So that became a big deal, and that will continue, which is a good thing. So that's a good thing that came out of this whole thing as well. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on COVID and kind of what we had to deal with and some of the hardships. But we're kind of through the hump of it. And I don't know what's gonna happen down the road. There might be other things that come up that's gonna create more issues for us. But our goal is to take care of families and help them. I always say, I want you to be healthier on the other side. Getting through this process is really, really important. And you can't run away from grief. You can't hide from grief. Unless you want to spend a lot of time in counseling or going to the ER room because you have panic attacks. Because you're not dealing with it, grief will work its way through in your life some way, somehow. And if you don't deal with it yourself, it will deal with it in a way that's not going to be the best for you. So, and that this isn't putting a plug in for anything in what we do other than you have to grieve the loss of someone in your life. I don't care if it's your husband, your wife, your parent, even your dog. I mean, we've lost lots of dogs, and my wife has cried and cried and cried for weeks on end when she lost her dog. I mean, losing something special to you is really hard, but you can't avoid that. And so it's important that we face these fears and that go back to the whole thing about the puppy and facing our fears and dealing with this stuff on the front end. Yeah, maybe it's uncomfortable. Maybe that's, you're like, I just don't really want to do this. Or my husband doesn't want to do it. I had a lady in Parker's that came in, her husband didn't want to plan funerals. He didn't want to do it. So one day, she told us this later, one day she shows up at the funeral home, rings the doorbell and says, I'm here to plan my funeral. She planned her funeral by herself. And 4 months later, her husband came in because he realized that she had done it and now he better do it himself. But the bottom line is, you know what, if you can't do it with somebody else, do it for yourself. Because it's going to be helpful for those, and it will make things, not necessarily the grief any easier, but it's definitely going to make it better for everybody who's left behind. I got 10 more minutes yet. I can keep talking.
We did have one question come through. Thank you for all your insight on that. The next question is, do you go to a home to meet with someone to do funeral planning with them? So
the husband and wife I just talked about yesterday, I was at their house. I was sitting at their kitchen table. They came in and he was in a wheelchair. That was the reason why he couldn't get out very well. And so they asked me to come. We do that. I'm going tonight. Today I'm driving down to Lowry at 1 o'clock. I've got a visitation. Same thing. Individual can't get out of the house and they want us to come there. And so there's 4 of us licensed funeral directors. And so we most certainly can go right there and right there to wherever they want us to go, whether it be a nursing home, to the house, doesn't really matter. Absolutely.
Is that a common practice, or is that something that has picked up over the years?
It's not. I think most people still want to come to the funeral home. I think, most people will call and make an appointment. So although just yesterday, it's a weird, we just have such an interesting, that's why it's so nice to live in our house, because we're really on call all the time. But someone called yesterday, they live in Glenwood, and they were in Wadena visiting, I think, her mom or somebody. And they called and they're like, hey, we were at your funeral home a couple months ago, met with your son. We got all of our paperwork filled out. So the stuff I was showing you earlier, we got all that filled out. And can we just stop by the funeral home on the way back to Glenwood? Are you there? We're like, yeah, we're here. So they came in and they hadn't signed they both want to be cremated. They had not signed their cremation authorizations yet. And so they signed their cremation authorization. They had groceries in the car and they're like, hey, we can't stay here very long because everything's melting in the car. But they were here like 10 minutes and they signed everything, got it all done, and they got in the car and drove away. So, it's just funny how things happen here, but we do this a lot and it's always on their terms. So most people will call and say, can we come and meet with you? We have everything here. So the room I'm in is my arrangement room or my display room. I'll just quickly show you since we got this. Can I turn this around? Maybe I can't, but so if you go in this room right here, so like this is, you can see, so those are all my urns. So can you see that? So those are just a small group of urns that I have. for families to look at. They can pick from those. These are pictures. That bottom one is my mom, actually. So you can see that one right there. Yep. So that was my mom. I took that picture of her when she was at Cozy Cup Cafe in Parker's Prairie. She was not cremated, but I had that done for her. She died 3.5 years ago. She lived at the nursing home in Parker's. But, so this is what we talk about with families right here. So this is kind of what it looks like for an actually cremation service, where you might have the tent and everything else like that. You can have that right out at the cemetery if you choose to do that. That's on the bottom. That's an urn vault right there. So that's what an urn vault looks like. And see, this is what we do with families. They come into this, they come here so they can see all this stuff. If I go to the house, which I'm happy to, I'll bring pictures of this stuff. So that's why it works to do that. These are vaults. So you can see those things right there. So if you look at those, some people look at them and goes, what are those baby caskets? They're not baby caskets. That's what a vault looks like. They're just small models of vaults. And if you look at that picture right there, can you see that? Yep. That's what it looks like at the cemetery. So you can see the vault lid is laid over to the side, the casket's on top, and the bottom of that vault is in the grave itself. So that's what we use for vaults. And so these are all just small models of different types of vaults that you can pick from. Some are very economical, some don't. Oops, my finger was in the way. Sorry about that. So anyway, so that's kind of what we show families. But I have this behind these doors so that when we're sitting in this room, we're not actually having to look at all that stuff, because I don't think that's necessary while we're making funeral arrangements. So I know we're getting close to 12. Ooh, yeah, we got 6 more minutes. I bet that might have added a few little questions, right? We got some questions from looking at that stuff.
We do have one more. Do you help us procure a place at the cemetery too, or do we need to arrange that?
That's a great question. So, yes, we'll take care of that for you. I mean, again, we're kind of like a one-stop shop. I mean, we're meaning that I may not be the sexton of that cemetery. So a sexton is the person in charge of the cemetery. They oversee the cemetery. So I know all the phone numbers. I know the name of the person. I could either get you to go out and meet with that person, and they'll actually show you the property. They'll show you the lots that are available. And so you can look at that stuff, and then you can decide from there what you want. They'll know, or I'll know what I can tell you what the cost of the cemetery lot is. Typically you pay for a cemetery lot and the perpetual care for that. Another really good question though that I have is you do not ever own a cemetery lot. Some people think they do. They get a cemetery deed. That's my lot. That's me. So I own that. You never own that. You own the right to be buried there. Okay. So when you buy a cemetery lot, you are buying the right to be buried on that piece of ground. If it was your property, you owned it, you would have to pay property tax on that little piece of property. So it's never yours. You own the right to be buried there. Okay. I saw a question come in.
Yep. What was the most challenging request related to a funeral, like bagpipe players or anything unusual like that?
Well, I have had several people want me to dress up, because you probably don't all know this. Some of you might know this, but I'm also a professional clown. So I went to school for it, and my name is Cubby the Clown. If you come in my funeral home, you can actually see a big thing that was a big write-up on me several years back, but I'm in different parades. But I've had people ask me to be a clown at their funeral. And I say to them right away, put it in writing. If it's in writing and you pay Cubby the Clown to be there, because Cubby charges to do it, then I'll do it. But you have to have it in writing, and your family has to know that. So anyway, but I'm gonna be buried in my clown shoes. I've already told my kids that. So
Will the coffin close with those things on?
no, there's going to be a little bump at the bottom of the casket where my clown shoes are going to be sticking out. So no, we laugh about that, but They are pretty big, like size 25 or something like that, so.
Another question that came in is, so if you only own the rights to be buried there, does that mean the land can still be sold?
No, so you own the deed for that right to be buried on that piece of property. So you do not own it, but you have the right to be buried there, and that right remains yours indefinitely. Okay, now in certain parts of the country, it's different. Down in like New Orleans and parts of Florida and the southern states where the water table is really high, they have like mausoleums down there, above ground mausoleums, because they can't bury people in the ground because of the water table. It wouldn't work. And so what ends up happening is you sometimes will buy maybe it's not in New Orleans, it might be in other parts of the world, because I've been in other countries where they've talked about this, but you will buy you have it for a certain amount of years. Because when you're buried above ground, and what happens is everything decomposes so fast that they basically push everything to the back, and then they can reuse that area again. And it might be just in the family. So, but bottom line is, your question is, nobody can ever, when you own the right to be buried there, they cannot come back and reuse that piece of property. It's yours indefinitely. And getting a marker is important too. We sell markers here. So most funeral homes have marker sales, or you can buy, a lot of people might know somebody that sells markers, but you can always, a funeral home is the best resource to go to on any of these topics. And if they don't know the resource, or if they can't do it themselves, they'll find someone that will help you with it. That makes sense? I think one interesting thing was I had we actually had someone cremated, and they made shotgun shells with their cremated remains and put them in the shotgun shells. And they took them out and they shot their loved one out of the shotgun. That was kind of cool. That was kind of cool that they did that. And someone just, they basically loaded some cremains in each one of the shotgun shells. It's kind of a cool thing. They didn't do the whole amount. They still buried some of it, but they did that, and it was just a kind of a cool thing. And again, that's why, think about these things and then talk about it to your funeral home director, and they'll make sure that it gets done. Look at that. You got 30 more seconds.
Yeah. So do you have any more props left and words of wisdom?
Well, I was going to I had this one right here. Thanks for asking. I do feel like sometimes I am just by the way, this came from Ashby. So this was from Ashby when they got rid of all their stuff. I was at a basketball game that our son was at. So sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of a conductor, kind of like I'm in charge of everything, but you want to stay in the background. So you're not like loud and make everybody know that what you're doing, but you're kind of in charge of the whole group. All right. So leader of the band. That's exactly right. The leader of the band. So that's one. And then the other one I have here is sometimes you have to be a police officer. And one time I wish I was, when we had a fight broke out in Parker's Prairie, and we had 4 sheriff departments with cop cars there. And it was an altercation where somebody came to the funeral home that wasn't invited to be there, but it was a public service. And that happens sometimes where people say, well, I don't want so-and-so to be here. Well, if it's a public funeral where I've announced it, I can't stop someone from walking in my funeral home. So, but if it is public, or if it's private, then we can do that. So sometimes you have to be a police officer, but I love driving my car really fast with my lights flashing and all that kind of stuff. So sometimes I tell the cops, yeah, I got here, a lot sooner than I thought, but I was driving 120 miles an hour to get there. And they just turn the other way. So I don't do that when there's a body in the hearse, but when I'm empty trying to get somewhere, I like to go fast. Because think about it. My hearse only goes, most of the time I'm driving like 20 miles an hour with this $100,000 vehicle. And you know what? You got to burn the cobs out. You got to get the engine running good. So when you run it 100 miles an hour, it's kind of fun. Thank you, everybody. I really, really appreciate your time. Hopefully you actually learned something today, and know this. If you're like, I didn't really want to ask that question, it was too personal, or if it's about me or my mom or my dad or my husband or whatever, you're like, you know what? But I really want to, I want to find out the answer. Just pick up the phone and call me. Make an appointment or just pick up the phone and call me. Let's come on in. Let's have a conversation. No obligation. You don't even have to use my services, but I'm happy to help educate, because even though I got chicken pox when I was 21 years old, I still like teaching. I love teaching, because knowledge is power. And when you actually have more knowledge, you have the power to actually do things and not be afraid of it. There's no need to be afraid of death. And especially if you know where you're going.
Great. Thanks you, Kurt. Thank you, Kurt. We have a lot of messages coming in saying great webinar, great information. Thank you. Very informative. So thank you so much for your time today.
Well, you're very welcome. I appreciate the time. Thank you for asking me. And if you ever want me to do it again, I'll be happy to do it. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
Fun. Fun.